All right, so just to be safe, let's go ahead and lock all of our layers, create a new layer, and name it background. And even though this is going to be the background layer, we're just going to leave it at the top for now and work on it until it's time to go down. So you notice the guides that we had already on this document when you opened it, and we are going to work only in this center square of the guide. So I'm going to zoom in some with my Control Plus, and I am going to use one of my shape tools. Now, one thing that's a little bit different about Illustrator as opposed to Photoshop is it has this little bar. Whenever there's a triangle that says there's tools docked underneath, if you hit this little arrow, it undocks it. It gives you a tearaway toolbar. So if you knew you were using shapes for something and you wanted to be able to see them at all the time, you just tear it away and leave it over there. Okay, so it's very handy. So we are going to get the rounded rectangle tool, and we are simply going to drag from this corner down to that corner. Okay? And the color we want is up here, and it's at the top, and it's the one that's called CMYK blue. Notice you get the tooltip when you roll over it right up here, makes it darker than what you already had. And we're going to go ahead and put a black stroke on it at one point. Okay, so it's not very visible. Now, one little tip that you might want to use so that you don't accidentally move this is if you hold the Control key down and hit the number 2, it locks this piece in place. Now, it doesn't lock the layer, but if we expand that layer, notice the rectangle has a lock next to it. So that is locked. So it's very handy. Okay? All right, so continuing on this layer, we need our Polygon tool, which is right here. And if we go ahead and just click somewhere, it brings up the options. What we want to create is a 3-sided polygon, also known as a triangle, and we'll worry about the radius later because we're going to resize it. So go ahead and click OK. This triangle, we'll go ahead and give it a white fill and no stroke. Okay, so right there you can't see it very well. I'm going to use my selection tool and just move it over the top so we can see it. With it selected, notice that we have up here some controls. And we have the ability to change the size of this. I also want you to know that in your window menu, you also have a transform panel. Okay, so you have multiple ways that you can work through Illustrator just like you did in Photoshop. So we have width and height, same thing here, width and height. And if you have the lock on, that means that when you resize it, it keeps it in proportion, width to height. If it has the line through it, that means that when you resize it, it's not going to keep it in proportion. Okay? So the width is going to be 0.5, and you actually have to type in IN for inches. Okay? And it doesn't keep it showing IN because it's in, we did it in points. Okay? So it translates it. Then the height is going to be 2 inches, so 2 IN. And once you do that, you get a long, narrow triangle. Now, this point up here at the top, we want this point to be in the very center of this rounded rectangle. So Illustrator's pretty good. Notice that as I move it towards the center, it actually helps me find it. Okay, so if I move it over here, I can see when it's in the center horizontally, and then I move it up and voila, it's in the center both horizontally and vertically. You might want to hit pause on the video to give yourself a second to do that. Now, we also have over here on our toolbar the rotate tool. Now, the rotate tool obviously allows you to rotate, okay? But look where it's rotating around, this little point in the center. That's our reference point. Well, if we use the rotate tool and hold down Alt key, it's going to move that reference point to the top. It's also going to pop up with this rotate dialog box, this new window. So if we want this little ray, because we're going to create like a sunburst pattern, if we want it to go all the way around, we know that we have 360 degrees in a circle. And if I want 20 of these triangles, that comes to 18 degrees for each. Now, if I just click OK, it's just going to rotate this. But if I click copy, it makes a copy of it. Now, don't hit anything yet, because if I go ahead and hit Control D at this point, it's going to duplicate that last step or set of steps that I did all the way around until I have a completed sunburst. That's 20 triangles. So I have one triangle that is still selected. If I go up to the Select menu, I can choose Same Fill Color, and it's going to choose all of the white fills. And at this point, only those triangles are white filled, and you can see them all here. And at that point, we can group, Control G, so now it's got its own group. And if we look up here in the control panel, notice that we have opacity. If we lower our opacity to 50%, and then I can Control click to deselect, let me zoom in again. Now we have a nice rectangle with a sunburst coming, or I shouldn't say a sunburst, a burst of rays coming from it. Okay? So, next thing I want to do is I'm actually done with my background layer. So I just want to reposition it so that it is underneath the fish. So I'm going to drag this whole layer so that it sits. It can sit above the guides, that's fine, but the two fish layers are above it. I'm going to unlock the two fish layers, and I'm going to start with the orange fish. The orange fish, I want to resize, and again, we can use our transform or we can use our controls up here. This time though, I want it to resize and keep the width and height in proportion, so I am going to lock that. Now, you can see that this says point. Earlier, we resized it as far as inches go, but we can also resize by percent. So if I want to make this 30%, it's going to change both the width and the height to 30%. And then I can move it onto that rounded rectangle that we created. Then I can go to my blue fish, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to keep the width and height proportions locked, and I'm going to resize this to 30%. And it was already a little bit smaller than this one, so it's going to remain a little bit smaller. And because the blue fish is on the top, I'm going to let it overlap just a little bit. Oops. I'm going to let it overlap just a little bit of the orange fish just to make it look like it's swimming in front of it. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and lock those two again, and I'm going to create a final layer that I am going to call bubbles. And I'm going to go back to my shapes, and I am going to use my ellipse tool. And I want to get the CMYK cyan with my ellipse tool, and I am going to click. So before we drew a circle by holding down the Shift key. Well, I can actually draw a circle of a specific size by clicking, and see the options pop up allowing me to type in 0.5 IN by 0.5 IN. Now, again, it translates it to point because that's what it does. But there goes a bubble. Then I'm going to control click outside of it to deselect, and I'm going to get white as my fill color, and I'm going to click. I'll go ahead and click on that. This time it's going to be 0.1 IN by 0.1 IN. And some of you may have said, why didn't I click this? I should have. I wasn't paying attention, because if I have this constrained, when I type it in once, that's all I need. Okay, so now I have a white bubble here. Well, I'm going to move that over there, kind of off center, and I'm going to select both pieces. I'm going to group it, and then if you hold, once it's grouped, you can see that it's grouped here. If you hold your Alt key down, notice how you get two arrows. You get a black and a white arrow there. That's actually showing you that you can duplicate that. So you hold down Alt and you do a click and drag until you have 5 of them. Okay, so now I'm going to leave this one at full size, but one of them I want to resize to, and I'm going to keep it in proportion, 20%. The next one shall be 35%. So they're incrementally getting bigger. Then 50%. And finally 65%. And then we can use our selection tool to move the bubbles so that it looks like they are coming out of their mouths. And I might unlock those 2 layers, and remember, if I hold Shift down, I can select more than one at a time to move. I can move it down just a little bit, and then I need to replace those smaller bubbles. There we go. So now I have a finished composition where I've used my layers, my selections, and some shapes. At this point, obviously I want to Control S, but I also want to export, save for web. And here I have the ability to save it in different formats. I'm going to choose a JPEG. And you might notice that you have, because we had a full page, it has a lot of white area behind it, which we don't want. So what I want to do then is I want to come down here after I've chosen JPEG, and I want to uncheck Clip to Artboard. And that simply allows me to export more or less just the image that I wanted. Then go ahead and hit save. You will possibly have to redirect it to your OneDrive and into your Illustrator folder to go on your Canvas portfolio.